Welcome to the second episode of our series, Innovate to Drive Equitable Access and Success, as we like to say, ideas. This series invites thought leaders in business, politics, journalism, and other fields to share their insights on the innovative tools and equity strategies we need to transform our communities. Throughout the series, we examine how our guests' work intersects with the college's transformational aspirations of access, completion, and post-completion success in an effort to advance our shared values. Each of our guests holds an extremely unique lens on building opportunity and encouraging equity in our communities. And I'm so excited for our guest today, Mr. Robert Espinoza. And before I share a little bit about him, let's give him a big Raptor welcome because it's his first time at Montgomery College. Thank you all. So Mr. Espinoza has some unique experiences. His leadership of the National Skills Coalition is a stellar example of the vision that is so valuable in our current climate and for our future. As we expand our ideas of the public good beyond categories of housing and food to education and training, we must also look at the landscape of jobs and the protection of workers. We must ask ourselves critical questions. Amongst some of those are, do all jobs offer growth opportunities for employees? Do they provide health insurance and retirement benefits? Can workers grow in an industry that needs their expertise? Or are there inequities that keep people from thriving? Today's guest, Mr. Robert Espinoza, will share thoughts about these questions and more, because it's more than just jobs. It is quality jobs. So I am going to proudly and energetically ask one of our students, Vilma Ortiz, to introduce Mr. Espinoza, and then we'll proceed to the conversation. So Vilma, would you please join me? And everyone, she is a business major who is graduating in the spring, has a strong interest in leadership. So please help me invite her up to introduce Mr. Espinoza. Thank you, Vilma. Thank you, Vilma.
Thank you, everyone. I'm thrilled to be introducing our guest today, since the mission of reducing workforce inequities is one that is close to my heart. As the daughter of immigrants from El Salvador and Guatemala, I am personally aware of how important immigrant workers are to the economy. The National Skills Coalition advocacy continues to strengthen skills training for workers and to protect their professional interests. Additionally, my personal pursuits in business spark my interest in equitable and inclusive leadership. With that said, today's guest is Robert Espinoza. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Skills Coalition. The coalition fights for inclusive, high-quality skills training so that more people have access to a better life and more local businesses see sustained growth. Mr. Espinoza is a prominent advocate in the fields of workforce, aging, and caregiving, where he spent 25 years advancing public policy around these and other pressing societal issues. Previous to leading the coalition, Mr. Espinoza served as the Executive Vice President of Policy at PHI. This organization focuses on improving jobs for the direct care workforce. This is composed of 4.8 million home care workers and nursing assistants who assist older adults and people with disabilities in various long-term care settings. Mr. Espinoza has testified before the U.S. House Committee on Education and Labor, emphasizing the urgent need to strengthen workforce interventions in direct care. He is engaged with multiple organizations that shape thought leadership around issues of social justice. He serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Espinoza also sits on the board of directors for the National Academy of Social Insurance, the Frameworks Institute, and the American Society on Aging. He hosts a widely syndicated podcast exploring the many challenges facing our country's caregiving system. That podcast is called A Question of Care. Mr. Espinoza holds a master's in public administration, a bachelor's degree in English, and a bachelor's of science in journalism. It is now my pleasure to introduce Robert Espinoza.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And let's give Vilma another round of applause, please. Wonderful job, and thank you for that. And welcome. Welcome again. Yes. Thank you so much for being here. We just heard a little bit about your background, your personal background, your educational background, your professional background, all of which is so exciting and fascinating. So we'd love for you to share a little bit more about that, and really what kind of what's your drive? What kind of led that journey for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when I think about, is my mic working? Yeah.
Yes.
When I think about sort of what brought me to where I'm at right now, I think about a few different stories, a few different moments in my career. My earliest was probably as a teenager, and I grew up in a small city in the state of Colorado. The city's called Pueblo, and I grew up. My mother was an immigrant from Mexico, came to the U.S. in the late '60s, and my father grew up in the southern part of the state in an area called the San Luis Valley, or El Valle de San Luis, which was, until the late 1800s, Mexico. And I remember in my teenage years, my father was a security guard working at a local military depot. And I asked him, like, what was his educational and career experience, and is this what he wanted to do in his career, et cetera. And he told me that in the Colorado that he grew up in, which was in the 1930s, 1940s, in that part of the country, it had its own version of Jim Crow. In fact, it was often referred to as Juan Crow, because it was separate drinking fountains, separate situations for white people and for what they called Mexicans and Indians. And he remembers drinking fountains that designated that. And he just grew up under a very different and hostile environment that told him when he was 18 in 1952 that he would not have the same career trajectory as his peers, right? He was a dark-skinned Latino man who grew up he spoke Spanish. He had a lot of, I think, signifiers that people would, through their racist mind, would assume that he wouldn't be able to have the same career. And so he joined the military, and he went to the Korean War first. 15 years later, he went to the Vietnam War, where he incurred quite a bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we grew up as a family with that. We grew up with him working a job that he loved and he appreciated, but he also knew that had there been a different career trajectory that had not been marred by structural racism, that our lives might have been very different. And that really informed my earliest lenses on inequities in the workforce. The second anecdote I want to share is that for the last 10 years, I worked for a group called PHI, as I was introduced, where we look closely at the challenges facing home care workers and nursing assistants, about 4.8 million in this country. It's larger than any other occupation in this country. And yet most of these workers earn minimum wage. They about 40% live in or near poverty. And workers barely last past 90 days in these jobs because they don't pay enough and because they're dangerous in many ways. And yet the people who rely on these jobs, older people and people with disabilities, if they don't have a worker, they could die, right? And this is a dilemma that's facing our whole country. And I think that all of that reinforces my perspective as I come into this organization and as we chart our way forward about what are the jobs that are so valuable to our economy, to everyday people, the people who tend to fill those jobs, and how do we create a system that ensures that they are properly compensated, properly trained, and that they have the opportunity to have advancement so they can live financially free.
Yes, thank you for sharing such personal stories and naming things that we need to name in our society, like structural racism, so that we can uplift those and ensure that those barriers and those challenges are addressed. I know the National Skills Coalition fights for it. I'm going to read it just so I get it exactly correct. Quote, inclusive, high-quality skills training so that more people have access to a better life and more local businesses see sustained growth. More people have access to a better life and more local businesses see a sustained growth. This is a critical combination, high quality jobs and business growth. Are there still people who believe that this is mutually exclusive? And if so, how do you engage with those people and or groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that the public sentiment on that is changing. I think more and more people are realizing that you need a well-compensated, trained workforce to make our economy thrive, to make businesses thrive. I saw it in the caregiving sector for sure, that when workers weren't properly compensated or respected for who they were, they left those jobs and they put the business in a bind, right? And so I think more and more businesses, at least in our experience, are beginning to see that. But the needle is so early on in the movement stage that I still think we need to get to a point where more industries see the value of workers, specifically of skilled and properly compensated workers, as part of their engine of growth, as part of their contributions to our society and the economy. I think we really believe in the importance of inclusive, high-quality skills training. So we recognize a few things. One is that the majority of jobs, I think 52% of jobs in this country, do not require a bachelor's degree, and yet they still require a good level of skill, right? And the best places to get that skill are in places like community colleges, but also other short-term training and education programs that we see in the community. And yet our public policy system has not been designed, was never initially designed to support that system. It was initially designed for the 4-year college degree and postgraduate degrees as well, right? And yet we're reaching a point in which we're seeing more and more workers are exiting the labor market. They're retiring, they're reducing their work hours for a variety of reasons. And so many industries are facing job shortages. And even when you can hire workers, they may not have the skills necessary to succeed. And so all of this raises a question about, are we investing enough as a country, at the federal level, at the state level, in skills training and education programs that prepare workers, and specifically workers that tend to have higher employment challenges: women, people of color, immigrants, older workers, parents, basically the majority of workers in this country.
And it's and you mentioned policy, and I would add to that also kind of education, adaptation. And we look at what a credit hour is and a Carnegie classification. When we look at also our human resources departments, not necessarily at Montgomery College, but in business and industry, and how they're identifying what the scope is, needed for certain jobs, what the requirements are. Is a 4-year degree really needed? What are the education skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed? So taking that dive. And we're going to get into skills and project-based and a little bit later. I really appreciate where you're going. I want to go back to something that was mentioned in the opening and something that you reflected on, and that is direct care workers and your advocacy for more than a decade for direct care workers. And I'm sure you're aware of how quickly the population is aging. Right, and that's a whole another economy that we're talking about in terms of supporting our aging population, and especially this is occurring in Montgomery County, where, as you know, our college is located. Right, several campuses. We just opened an East County Education Center in the eastern part of our county. So at the same time, we have a robust offering of health sciences, healthcare programs. So when we try and square that circle, and I want to harken back to something else that was mentioned by Vilma, your 2021 testimony about this issue, specifically about home health care aides, right in front of the U.S. House Committee on Education and Labor. What role, and you kind of gave me the segue to this, you mentioned community colleges, what role can community colleges play in this? I don't even call it an effort, I'll call it a movement in regards to this structural change, this paradigm shift that we need to have. How do you see community colleges fitting in?
Yeah, it's a big part, and certainly in the 10 years that I worked at PHI on these issues, we worked both with policymakers to understand the challenges that we're facing this workforce and the solutions, and we also worked with that broad ecosystem of actors that are a big part of what you might call the players that decide whether, how these workers are trained, et cetera. And they include community colleges, they include community-based organizations, other types of training providers, labor unions, et cetera. I would say a few things. I mean, one is we are seeing an incredible need for direct care jobs and support at home. You mentioned the aging of America. It's also people are living longer, and when you live longer, the number of disabilities and chronic conditions also increases, so you're going to need more support. At the same time, because we're aging, a lot of people are retiring or they're exiting the labor force, or according to a recent job report, people are cutting their hours for reasons that people don't quite understand, right? All of this means that when you look at the research about how many job openings in direct care will need to be filled in the next 10 years, the current estimate is about 9.3 million. And the big question for us is, how will we ever, as a country, fill those jobs if they continue to pay $12 an hour and don't offer full-time, et cetera? It's also a workforce that's predominantly made up of women, women of color, immigrants. They are all working in low-wage jobs. And they are devalued, I think, because of that. They've always been devalued, I think, as a labor segment, unfortunately. But also the people they support are devalued. So older people, people with disabilities, in nursing, it's no surprise that 1 in 4 casualties of the COVID-19 pandemic in the first 2 years were nursing home residents, right? It's one of the most neglected areas of our country. So when it comes to community colleges playing a role, I mean, I would say a few things. One is that certainly community colleges can play a big role in working with, developing relationships with employers, home care agencies, nursing homes, and others to create a better pipeline of students into those jobs and see how valuable they are for our society and how important they are, I think, for the people they affect. The jobs also need an overall transformation. I think we've seen community colleges be advocates in their state houses, at the federal level, et cetera, for interventions that would improve wages for workers and money into the whole system, right? The other piece is that older workers, I can imagine, are also a big part of the population that are coming through community colleges. And to the extent that we think about populations that can benefit the sector, we should think about older people as a potential labor pool. Yep.
And I appreciate that. And that's something that we work in terms of policy as well. And so we talk about our transformational aspirations of access, completion, and post-completion success. It is this idea of completion of our credentials all having economic, social, and community impact. And that post-completion success is that they will lead to jobs with family-sustaining wages. That leads to individual economic and social mobility that will then transcend to intergenerational mobility, right? So how do we do that, right? The policy level, at the education and training level, how does that happen? When we think about NSC's Making College Work campaign, and it's all about, and I'm going to quote, driving policy change that widens the path to post-secondary education. It begins to redress structural racism in our education and training systems and makes colleges work for everyone. Can you, and I know you can, so would you talk specifically about, and you mentioned kind of some of them, which national policy changes can make college work better and how?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to hit on a point that you just made, because it undergirds a lot of our policy recommendations, which is that we do live in a country that has a very uneven playing field for students and for workers, right? I think that the trajectory of many Black and Latino students, Indigenous students, low-wage students, et cetera, is just very different than their peers. And you see it where, some researchers have pointed out that inequality starts as early as birth, and it's determined by zip code because of the community that you grow up in. I grew up in a working class family in the 80s and 90s. We were precariously working class, and we knew that we were 1 or 2 paychecks away from poverty, and I think that's what a lot of people deal with. And it was never in our horizon growing up that I could pursue a college degree or a graduate degree, which I did. And so it was because of policies that stepped in that showed me a very different pathway that pulled me from that and gave me that opportunity. And so I do think, so many of the policies that we articulate are about in recognition that there are many inequities that students and workers are facing that dictate whether or not you succeed in college. Some of the policies are things like, how do we help cover the cost of college? Certainly, 4-year degrees, there's lots of stories about how expensive that is, but for many people, especially low-wage students, low-wage workers, et cetera, covering a community college or covering even a short-term training program in home care is financially unaffordable if you're making $7 to $10 an hour, right? Second is, how do you support students holistically? They are often parents, we talk about sandwich caregivers. They're taking care of children and their aging parents in many ways, right? They might need childcare support and elder care support, transportation support, et cetera. And how do you strengthen partnerships at the local level where community-based organizations are working with employers, with immigrant rights organizations, with so many others to be able to provide what we might call the wraparound supports that so many workers need, and we forget until we step into the lives of a worker who's living, or a student who's living that kind of life, that the barriers are in almost every corner of the street, right? And so making sure that we're tackling those barriers to be successful, and I think there's a big role for policymakers.
Yeah, I thank you so much for sharing that, and the policymakers, the people right behind those policies, right, and how we're preparing those people, and thinking about growing up, and someone who's working second and third shift, or 2 out of the 3 shifts of the day, and what transportation is available to that person who's working third shift when there's less is there, right? Mm-hmm. Who's taking care of the children, who's all of these things, and I think about the diversity of Montgomery College, where 14-18% of our students are parenting. Right? They're parenting students, where 36% of our students have experienced food insecurity in the past 30 days. Right? We're about 1 in every 5 of our students is a Pell Grant recipient, and the average income for those students is about $28,000. Right? And they're trying to get that education and training to get that family sustaining wage, and how are we supporting them? And we have great supports at the college. We also face those realities head on, right, and do our best, and we're always learning and growing to support in an equitable way the diverse population that we have. And when I think about that and supporting diverse populations, I know that NSC's focus on racial equity and inclusion, and there's a strong focus on racial equity and inclusion. So we'd love to hear some of your thoughts in regards to how the anti-racism really fits into your advocacy and action strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a big part, I think, of our ethos and of the policies that we argue for. So, we start with the premise that it is an uneven playing field that we live in, and that, a history of generations of systemic racism have hurt the employment and education trajectories of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people, right? And that shows up as disparities in terms of who gets into colleges, 4-year colleges, 2-year colleges, et cetera, who stays there and who graduates. And then, of course, once you graduate, the employment, earnings, and career trajectories are also different, and they're stratified along racial lines, also gender lines, also other lines, et cetera, right? In that recognition, we say, well, then we need public policies that even that playing field and ensure that every worker has the ability to pursue the training and education they need to succeed and to help America and the US flourish, right, economically. And that means, promoting policies that strengthen short-term training and education programs. We advocate for quality non-degree credentials that are portable. So let's say you're trained as a nursing assistant in Maryland. If you want to work in DC, if you want to work in Virginia, you're not able to transfer that certification from one state to the next because the training requirements vary by state, right? And so that creates some versatility issues for the workforce, but it's incredibly punishing for the worker because they're not able to seek those opportunities, right? And it's expensive to retrain over and over. So we argue for quality non-degree credentials across industries that support that. We also argue for better data, and that can seem a little bit wonkish for people. I think it's math and it's numbers and it's stats, et cetera. And yet it is often, in our experience in my career, it is the earliest ways in which many people in policy or in the media, et cetera, begin to see that a problem even exists, right? If you collect data, for example, I'll use an example, the extent to which Southeast Asian women are graduating from 4-year colleges, right? What you will see is that there's significant disparities between their graduation rates and all of their peers. And that's about race, ethnicity, and country of origin, and so many different barriers that are intersecting and compounding their lives. And so having that data and requiring a state to collect on it, to analyze it in the right way, report on it, and then inform the public and policymaking is a huge win. In fact, it's hard to imagine in my career any issue that I worked on or been successful in over the years that didn't have a strong empirical base to it, where you were able to bring data and say, this problem does exist. And I would say in a political climate in which so many are trying to erase that history and argue against even the existence of inequality, right? That behooves us even more to produce that, right? And I will say this is something that works in a bipartisan way. We have worked in red states and blue states and everything in between. And people do understand the importance of having stronger data infrastructures, better measuring, outcomes among students and workers, and then disaggregating it by categories like race, gender, and so much more. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us.
Well, thank you again for sharing that. And I think about that also in context of specifically where we are. And I know you're National Skills Coalition. At the same time, Montgomery College, we are so close to Virginia, to DC. I mean, to Pennsylvania, Delaware, right, West Virginia. So when we think about where people are gaining skills, and then are those skills, while the skills may be applicable, are they going to be seen in the same way if they transition to a different state? One of the things, and kind of honing back to how you ended with data, is right now, we're looking through and seeing of our credentials, the ones that lead directly to a family sustaining wage or that have a direct pathway, and who is in those, right? The percentage of our students who are in those categories, and breaking that down also by demographic, right? Because going back to, it's not just access to education is not good enough, right? It's not just completion, it is ensuring that those credentials have economic, social, and community value. So when we think about, and I wonder, I'm going to go off the script a little bit, do you think, what type of movement would occur? Because within access of our transformational aspiration, we have this bold objective of ensuring that every Montgomery County Public School student, by the time they're in 7th grade, has a meaningful interaction with Montgomery College. And so what do you think would drive policymakers, or would it drive policymakers, if that meaningful impact was around credentials of economic value, therefore seeing a decrease in the much needed but underpaid, undervalued, under-resourced jobs? I wonder if you think if people saw that shift, that they might change the narrative, whether it is loan forgiveness, whether it is kind of a house loan in terms of after you graduate, whatever it is. Do you think that type of movement might motivate policymakers to change things?
I would hope so. Yeah, I mean, it's compelling to me, and I think it would be compelling to a lot of policymakers. Absolutely. I mean, I think that what I always am surprised by, and I have to remind myself, is how much the conversations with any policymaker, federal, state, local, et cetera, is often a conversation, right? It requires a fair amount of education. It requires a certain amount of advocacy where you're persuading, you're learning, you're in discourse, right? And I do think that understanding why a policymaker may not be supportive or not aware of an approach like this is key. But it feels like if you were able to connect the dots from where you started, the 7th grade to community college, and the ways in which all of that supports businesses and the economy, et cetera, it is important. And it's especially important, I would say, in today's climate where you're seeing the labor force participation rate, or the number of working people, right, decrease, right? I mean, many industries are reporting workforce shortages. I mentioned the direct care one in particular, but let me mention another one, which is a few weeks ago, we released new research. We commissioned it at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Okay. And we looked at, there were 3 major federal infrastructure laws that were passed 2 years ago, in 21, 3 years ago. And they're directing $2 trillion at least around the country, and the money's flowing into states, right? In areas like clean energy, manufacturing, et cetera. And when we wanted to study what extent will it support workers as well, and we found that these 3 historic federal investments will create 3 million jobs per year across the country and add 19 million job years to people who take advantage of those jobs, right? And the investments will be 5 to 10 years. So we're talking about millions of jobs and even more millions of job years for workers across the country. And yet, our latest research shows that something like 52% of jobs that are being created by these investments will not require a bachelor's degree, which is a great opportunity for people. And yet, is there a skills gap in this country? Will there be enough skilled workers in clean energy, manufacturing, all those sectors and occupations that make up infrastructure to fill those jobs? They won't unless we as a country invest in community colleges, in short-term training education programs, right? So this is a great example where I think being able to, and because of all of that, if we don't fill it, we anticipate a labor shortage of something like 1.4 million jobs, right? Wow. Job openings. And that's a huge number. I mean, when you think one job is a big problem, especially if you're building a bridge or a highway or any kind of critical infrastructure that makes our lives easier and possible. And so I think the more lawmakers are able to connect the dots between the roads they travel, the people who hire and pave and work those industries, right? And the necessary training and education system that makes all of that possible, I think you're hopefully going to see more support.
Thank you. You said, and you mentioned skills gap, and I want to have just kind of a Paul's point, and just for clarification, differentiation, if there is any, is that the same thing when we hear people say middle skills gap? Or are they too, because the skills gap could be broader, middle skills gap might be more specific to certain fields or certain, so could you share, what do we mean, we hear this middle skills gap, what do we mean by that? What does it mean to business and industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So the skills gap is basically the gap between the skills that are needed to fill a certain percentage of jobs versus the number of workers who have those skills. Okay. So it's if you bridge that gap, then you have workers meeting those jobs and the challenges, right? Middle skill are jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree, but require skill development from typically a community college or short-term training and education program, right? And then of course there are a lot of jobs that are more low skill, et cetera, and there can be a skills gap with low skills, but middle skill is typically where you see the skills gap, yeah. And we have a website that tracks the skills gap or the skills mismatch, not to throw another term in there, in states around the country, and it's wide everywhere. Our theory is that it's going to grow even wider as more jobs are created and those training programs don't keep up because of financial disinvestment.
So that is a great segue, because I'd love for you to spend just a few more moments on that, because it's a really big component of I think of what you're doing and the site and the resources that you have. And you mentioned it and you kind of slid it in there, but let's just skills mismatch, right? And the time that has been dedicated to creating this skills mismatch for each state. Just if you could talk a little bit about that and why it matters, and anything that you've kind of gleaned that's like super interesting from state to state. Would love to hear your thoughts on the skills mismatch.
Absolutely. So I mean, I would talk about it in a few ways. One is that I mentioned that a skills gap is the gap between the skills needed to fill a number of jobs and then the people who have those skills. And yet there's a lot of nuance there, right? Because it isn't just a total number. There's often skills, industries change, right? So technology is probably the best example. Technology is repeatedly changing, the rise of generative AI, and of course that even changes every 6 months, et cetera, right? That means that workers need to have those skills in order to fill those jobs and will be more successful. And yet that requires a fair amount of training, of upskilling and reskilling. It requires the ability to make sure that our workforce can not only fill those jobs with the foundational skills, but with like new skills that are acquired, right? And so I think part of the conversation about making sure that we have enough skilled workers in different states and countries is being able to assess, like, just from a human capital perspective, do we have the number of skilled workers to fill those jobs? And then how do we create kind of a robust and cyclical training system that is constantly providing new skills? Yeah.
So that's actually, you're fantastically segueing into these questions, and we think about this, so kind of put this in a more philosophical component of, a business and or industry, a person needs talent now, right? And then we have to break that down at times because they're saying, well, there's a 4-year degree, but there's talent that I could do maybe after 6 months and I could contribute. And then I could continue my education and training as I'm directly contributing to your business and your industry. But that's not the way we work, because that's kind of skills-based, project-based. I mean, so we're educating and training, simultaneously providing business and industry with the talent that they need, educated and trained individuals. Because in some fields, as we've discussed, not enough attention to it, but as we discussed, in some fields, that entry component is not going to lead to a family sustaining wage. So it's incumbent upon us at Montgomery College, and I know others, to be able to dedicate to that consistent training. What is I think I understand your thoughts on that approach, but do you have ideas on how we accomplish that in just a rapidly changing economy, business and industry? We're talking about the fourth industrial revolution. We're talking about so much that's happening. People want workers now, and once they have them, they want to keep them, obviously, but we want to keep them educated and trained so they can be not only the workforce for the present, but for the future. So I know kind of maybe a little heady, philosophical, but just thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, I mean, they're all great questions, and they're big questions that I think we're grappling with, and a lot of my colleagues in the field are grappling with. I mean, I think a few points. I mean, I definitely think that people call it future-proofing, right? The idea that you're creating solutions that are also anticipating where the future might go. In the conversation around AI, so many of the conversations about AI in the workforce, they fall into two camps. In one camp, it says AI will actually displace workers and replace them for skills that they used to do before, right? And especially in the creative jobs or in jobs like typically more jobs that do require a four-year degree, et cetera, where it can do some of that, right? The other companion argument is this idea that it can actually make jobs easier. It can supplement, the kinds of tasks that previously were done by people, but actually could be done more efficiently and done by AI and other types of technologies, right? And we saw this in home care, for example, right? So if we really think about how do you get enough home care workers to support millions of older people and people with disabilities, it does not make sense given how rapidly we're aging and the incredible need to have a home care worker at every single person's home for 2 to 3 hours. In fact, most home care visits are 15 to 30 minutes, egregiously, right? I think that's a major problem. But that's a capacity issue, right? So one of the ways AI can help is, one of the hardest things to do in home care is to schedule. And home care workers typically have anywhere from 2 to 7 clients, right? They're traveling long distances, they're trying to figure out how to get there, and their supervisors struggle because the scheduling is so intricate. So we can, if AI can be used to facilitate that, then the worker and the supervisor are relieved of that challenge and are able to focus more on that. Another piece is AI may be able to designate who is in kind of physical and emotional need and create more of a category where maybe not everybody needs a home care worker that day. And we need to figure out how to do that, and there's a way to use AI in that way, right? This is all, by the way, I'm presenting it in a way that assumes that AI does not have problems, which it does. And in fact, there's quite a bit of research and studies and class action lawsuits that are asking whether AI also reinforces inequities. But I guess I'm speaking from the ideal and the philosophical, right? That if we can imagine AI as something that supplements but doesn't supplant workers, I think it could actually be really positive for us.
Thank you. Do you see, whether it be with AI or just a general philosophical approach of continuous learning, education and training, work-based, skills-based, project-based, to get someone on a path? Because let's face it, our family sustaining wage might change, right? Mm-hmm. So me, sitting in front of you as a partner and 2 children of many more responsibilities than I did, as an 18, 19-year-old, right? So maybe, maybe 30, 40, 50, depending on where I'm living, $1,000 is fine. But that progression to make sure that as my life changes, my family sustaining wage can change with it. Have you seen or are you experiencing business and industries that are taking kind of that approach, that longevity approach to keeping folks educated and trained so that they are there for the day, today, and the future and beyond?
So we haven't looked at that, I think, from a systematic research perspective. Like, I can't speak to the ways in which businesses or industries, et cetera, are thinking about sort of how do you create quality jobs, essentially, right? Yeah. That compensate enough, that train, advance, et cetera, even if the market isn't supporting that or policy is behind, right? Like, we haven't looked closely at that. I do know from my experience and more in the direct care context that you do see some states that are in the lead in thinking about how do you create quality jobs for workers, for direct care workers, that do offer not just the living wage, but a wage that allows them to thrive financially, right? It's one thing to live. It's another to actually be able to do everything you want, which is probably the ideal, right? And so some states like California and Washington State and so many others are leading the way, and so many other states are taking the steps back, right? And so we do live in a divided country, at least two Americas, where the realities of, at least on this context, direct care workers in one area are very different than the others, right? The second piece is that I do think that it behooves us to think about family policy as kind of the overarching umbrella that all workers and students need, right? Are we providing paid sick leave and family medical leave, right? Are we providing universal long-term care so people don't basically impoverish themselves in order to pay for a nursing home? Nursing homes are incredibly expensive, right? And the government doesn't help in a lot of ways, right? And so the more we create those kinds of, childcare is another example, right? The more we create that public safety net, those wraparound supportive services that so many students, workers need, I think you're gonna see some of those inequalities, I think, not disappear, but certainly dissipate a bit. Yeah.
And again, I am saying thank you because I'm learning so much and I'm so appreciative of your presence and your words, your thoughts. I think complementing that and those policies in terms of access, I also think of the business and industry and the policy internally that is going to make me feel supported to go and see a medical practitioner.
That's right.
Right, to know that my job is not at risk because I have to take time off to go do that. And a lot of people fear that if you take that time off to do that, and I know this from upbringing, that you may not have your job because you are seen as interchangeable.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think about, you mentioned something just briefly a few moments ago, and I think you were kind of leaning towards one side, but I want to reflect on it because we do get, I don't say caught, but we do get in certain conversations about wage, right? So when you think about it and when you kind of have when you posit in terms of who you're speaking with, and maybe it changes based on population, we all know context matters. Where do you see yourself going to the most? Because we could think about income, we could think about family sustaining wage, and we could think about poverty, right? Three things that are very different. If we looked at the average income in Montgomery County versus saying we want to get everyone to have a family sustaining wage versus poverty level. Three, and you mentioned, I bring this up because you mentioned, well, should it just be a living wage? And that's why we say kind of family sustaining. It's not just that, it's more than just you're able to live. And I guess we could, over the nomenclature, but where do you fall on that, Robert?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It's probably where I fall personally because National Skills Coalition, because we focus on training and advancement, et cetera, doesn't weigh in often on the wage and compensation question, right? But what I would say personally is that I do think, what is the North Star when we talk about either wages or earnings or poverty rates, et cetera? And I feel like it's the idea that nobody in this country, should have to be in poverty. Based on where they work, right? Yeah. And that if anything, we should be creating a society where everyone has the financial freedom they want and the family supports to be able to live in a good community and in health, et cetera, and to age, and this sounds dark, but to die the way we want. I mean, it is a lifespan that we're talking about. And so I think that, policymakers struggle because the domains shift, right? So wages become about living wages versus minimum wages, et cetera, right? Living wage is often a wage that takes into consideration local cost of living, and there are lots of calculators that take into consideration that piece, right? And certainly it can sometimes be higher, it's often higher than a minimum wage, and it's certainly higher than a poverty wage, right? But it's all of that. One of the biggest barriers that those policy definitions face, whether it's wages, earnings, or poverty rates, is the federal definition on poverty, right? Which is, it's not arbitrary, but it's outdated and it's incomplete. And so, we used to use the phrase in or near poverty, right? Which is, it doesn't make sense, right? Anyone who's ever lived through poverty knows that if you're at 200% of the level versus 100 versus at poverty, the truth is you can't make ends meet, right? And it's crushing and it's generational. And it makes it impossible to have good health, to go to school, and it builds. Poverty is expensive, debt is expensive, right? And so I think the policy containers, the vernaculars we've created around all of these, I think obscure the fact that what we should aiming for is really a world in which all of us have financial freedom, and what is the responsibility of both the public and private sector to engender that.
And I very much appreciate that, and especially the ending with what is the responsibility of the public and private sector. Because I feel like sometimes we see wins, or things that are categorized as wins, and things that they move the needle. And I'm not putting a value on it, but I'm just going to factual statement in terms of if we raise the minimum wage to 15 to 20 to 20 hours, that's 40. It's 40 grand. Does that put people where kind of the, not putting it on you, but
Right.
to that point of being able to live in the way in which they want to live? However, that's $5 more than the 15 that the state was offering or the county was offering, right? So I wonder, and it's public, private. How do we get through that? At the same time, we have other levers to pull, right? So that and kind of a public policy set with also maybe contributions additional in terms of, again, you go to school debt free. Right, you don't have a high house mortgage, right? Because we're giving you a loan or something like. You don't have a vehicle because the infrastructure of public transportation is such that you don't need a vehicle. You don't have a car note every month. So one of the points I'm trying to make is that your money, your dollar goes farther if you have less to spend on. You can do more. So someone making that much money, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 with no college loan, no house note, no car note, that's much different than just tacking on $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 every month of just bills.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so one last question, and I want to just open it up for a few questions. And I had this conversation with you all day. And I'll definitely get last word. But just in terms of the skills, and is there any other advice that you would give to education leaders and business partners as we strive to work together? You've mentioned so much, but just want to ask you one last time before we open it up for a few questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we've been talking a lot about kind of the policy dimensions of these topics, and the other dimension that hits me is the role of narrative change, right? That part of the challenges of moving any kind of policy reform that supports workers or students or marginalized people writ large is that we live in a country that has deeply held mindsets that prevent that. So one of the deeply held mindsets that we have as a country is this notion of individualism, right? So they make sense, a large percentage of our population will make sense of poverty as something that the individual is responsible for, right? They didn't make the right choices. They didn't pursue the trajectory in front of them. They're lazy, which is a debate around Medicaid work requirements, right? And those deeply held mindsets are kind of the universe under which these issues that we're talking about get discussed and debated or passed or not. Right. And so I think to any extent that a college or us as individuals can help begin changing minds in the same way that we change policies or business practices, that's going to be a big part of it. And I fear, just my role is often in the federal or in the state context, right, that the discourse is so divided that to one side screaming at the other, and I'm not doing false equivalencies here, I'm saying it makes it hard to sort of kind of navigate the nuance here, that, one side is going to always win, and one side is, in these debates, right? And so I think that the narrative change is so critical because it can help rattle that kind of thinking. It can make us think, well, actually, when you see high poverty rates, it's not the result of people's choices. It's actually the result of barriers that they faced and that they were born into and will probably pass away into, right? And so how do we create and address those systemic barriers so that we can think more about kind of a stronger workforce and education system?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It makes me think about, and I didn't mention it earlier, but you mentioned some research in terms of poverty and generational. And one of the individuals who I'm sure does that work is Raj Chetty and his group and the Opportunity Atlas. So I think that's something, a resource for people to check out if you're interested. We do, I soaked up a lot of your time, but I went off script, so it's kind of like audience asking questions. They weren't all my questions. But we do have a few minutes for some questions. I see we have students, we have faculty, we have staff, we have, you have a question? Okay, Press, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Espinoza, for joining us. In the very beginning, you said something really poignant about how the people that are being cared for by direct care workers are devalued. And I see that as a real impediment to people who are doing the work earning living wages, earning family-sustaining wages. Is there kind of a cultural change that we have to undergo? And how do we reconcile that with like the ambition of capitalism? Because it's always going to be there, I would think.
Yeah, it's a big question. And I do think that the COVID-19 pandemic, especially year one, is a great case study for looking at the ways in which our country kind of claps for essential workers and then devalues them in the same sentence, right? But because nursing homes were disproportionately ravaged in ways that no other setting was. I mean, maybe hospitals, but nursing homes in terms of like, people who live there. I do think, and I've long believed that, that intersection of a largely women of color immigrant workforce supporting largely low-income older adults and people with disabilities is both it's a metaphor and just a stark reality of so many inequities that we need to tackle as a country. And it's hard not to think about the biases that shape all of that, right? So when you think I'll offer two examples. One is historical, which is that, for decades, home care workers were exempted from wage and overtime protections, home care workers and agricultural workers. And when you look at the historical record in Congress during the New Deal in the 1930s, it was a block of senators from the South who were trying to preserve the Jim Crow, before that slavery order of women of color working in their homes, supporting each other, who argued for exempting them because they said it wasn't real work. It's where women are naturally aligned with it, and also they're largely black, and so that it's not seen as real work, right? And Congress bought it, and they exempted them, along with agricultural workers, which were also largely, brown and black and other people of color, right? And that continued for decades. In fact, it wasn't addressed, at least legally, until 2013. And yet, evaluations since then have shown that people's wages in home care have actually not improved because of that. So even if you're exempt, even if you have the legal protection, you have to change the culture for that to become lived, right? And so I think that, bringing to your point, my final point before we open it up to questions was around narrative change, right? That unless we change how people think and what they believe and what they prioritize as a policy imperative, it's hard to imagine that we'll change the laws in ways that aren't just perfunctory, right? In ways that aren't just, may have some impact for a few years, but in the long term, you still lose, right? And so I think they go hand in hand. Yeah.
So with your experience, I know when I saw another hand, thank you for the question and thank you for the response. With your experience, have you seen where that is not in the continental, North America, but across the globe, is there a group, whether it's a country, a continent, is there a city, a town that's doing that well?
I wish. We did quite a bit of early analysis on countries around the world and their care systems, and comparing like what's in the U.S. with Europe, with what's in Latin America, with what's in Africa, et cetera. You immediately fall into some real challenges because the systems are just set up differently, right?
Sure.
But let's take, for example, and there's a lot more research because of inequities in the Western Europe than there are in other parts of the world, right? And yet, even in that context, right, in some countries that have some of the most progressive kind of national models around socialized healthcare is one example, right? They haven't thought about elder care. And they haven't necessarily thought about supporting people with disabilities. And I was part of a conversation a few years ago in Canada where we brought in researchers from Europe and a lot of countries that were also facing labor shortages. And they were trying to figure out how to draw on immigration as one solution, right? And I remember thinking of this, it brings me back to your question about the range of inequities that this idea surfaces, right? Is that we have a history in this country and probably at least in other parts of Western Europe, to both punish immigrants and then also ask that they take the jobs that no one wants, right? And we have this idea that, that's a solution, right? And instead of saying, well, what if we made all these jobs great And we created pathways to citizenship that, because immigrants have long been a big part of our economy, of healthcare and medicine and science, right? And yet they're falling into the same trap, right? If you're thinking as a country that the way to solve the shortage writ large is not to make the jobs better, but to just bring people from abroad to fill those jobs and then kick them out when their visa ends, like that's a serious problem, right? Rooted in heavy paternalism and just, it's missing the issue.
Yeah. Thank you. We have another quick question before we, yes?
I was wondering real quick, do you have any information about what skills that can be acquired quickly, 6 months or less, have the best ability to propel someone into a better economic bracket?
Ooh, that's a hard question. Of course,
Wow.
that'd be the last question.
Wow. We have
exactly. That's a
we have this
really
question
hard
and then your wrap up and then.
I will say no. I don't have the answer to that. It's a fantastic question, and I feel like it's getting to this point that if we were to also prioritize certain types of skill development that can be rapidly acquired, that you create more versatility, at least in a foundational way, right? And then you build on that. It's a great question. I don't have the answer, unfortunately.
Well, before I ask you if you have any final thoughts, I want to thank you again, and I'll do that again before we officially. And I also want to uplift what you just said because I'm not sure. Hopefully, everyone heard it, but I don't know if it landed on everyone. Someone with your experience, personal, professional, educational experience, your current role and previous roles as a leader, think that more of us need to be able to share, as you just did, with confidence and excitement for learning that we don't know. I don't know. And I'm not saying that just because I say I don't know and I want to learn and I don't have all the answers and I don't do things right all the time. You know, I'm saying it, but people need to hear from leaders, in my perspective, that we don't know. Let's figure it out together. You may have some knowledge that I don't have. You probably definitely have some knowledge that I don't have. Let's say that for a fact. And together we can learn. Together we can grow. Together we can get a better sense of where we're coming from and then chart a path forward. Maybe grab some more people here, some more people there. We need more leaders to say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm excited about finding out. Great question, you know? Yeah. So I wanted to uplift that before do you have any final words before I kind of wrap us up?
No, just thank you. It's so good to see all the faces in the audience, and I love the questions. Thank you for inviting me in. Yeah. It's been great.
Well, we are so happy to have you for your very first time at Montgomery College. Hopefully not your last time. For all the employees who are here, I really hope that this was insightful in terms of how we think about not only completion, but post-completion success and even access, how our students and the residents who we seek to serve are accessing educational opportunities, how we're creating education and training that's leading to a life that individuals desire to have. And for the students here, I see there's many students here, I hope that you have really gained some insight in terms of opportunities for advocacy, opportunities for how you can impact not only the workforce, but your own education and training experiences, opportunities for how you select and identify what you're going to pursue, not only next, but after that, and after that, and after that. So on that note, I will say, Mr. Espinoza, you have been just a fantastic partner in this conversation. Again, I at Montgomery College are so happy that you have joined us today. I'm so happy that everyone here has joined us today. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out before we transition to MCTV. Can we give them a round of applause? So on that note, thank you, Mr. Espinoza. Thank you all. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.